Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I spend on it thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you'd like to keep it going out to thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and also gets you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. If monthly's a big ask, which I do completely understand, of course, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And you can also support the show without having to do so financially, but just telling people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep and you think that I can help them, just tell them where to find us. And that's enough of that. Let's get on with tonight's reading, where we're going to start learning about the history of romantic literature. The Flourishing of Romance and the Rise of Allegory by George Saintsbury, Professor of Rhetoric and English Literature in the University of Edinburgh. Preface. As this volume, although not the first in chronological order, is likely to be the first to appear in the series of which it forms part, and of which the author has the honor to be the editor, it may be well to say a few words here as to the scheme of this series generally. When that scheme was first sketched, it was necessarily objected that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to obtain contributors that could boast intimate and equal knowledge of all the branches of European literature at any given time. To meet this by simple denial was, of course, not to be thought of. Even universal linguists, though not unknown, are not very common, and universal linguists have not usually been good critics of any, much less of all, literature. But it could be answered that if the main principle of the scheme was sound, that is to say that if it was really desirable not to supplant, but to supplement the histories of separate literatures, such as now exist in great numbers, by something like a new Hallam, which should take account of all the simultaneous and contemporary developments and their interaction. Some sacrifice in point of specialist knowledge of individual literatures not only must be made, but might be made with little damage. And it could be further urged that this sacrifice might be reduced to a minimum by selecting in each case writers thoroughly acquainted with the literature, which happened to be of greatest prominence in the special period, provided always that their general literary knowledge and critical habits were such as to render them capable of giving a fit account of the rest. In the carrying out of such a scheme, occasional deficiencies of specialist dealing, or even of specialist knowledge, must be held to be compensated by range of handling and width of view. And though it is in all such cases hopeless to appease what has been called the rage of the specialist himself, though Mesophanti, doubled with a Saint-Beuve, could never in any general history of European literature hope to satisfy the special devotees of Romansh or Plattdeutsch, not to mention those of the greater languages. Yet there may, I hope, be a sufficient public who, recognizing the advantage of the ends, will make a fair allowance for necessary shortcomings in the means. As, however, it is quite certain that there will be some critics, if not some readers, who will not make this allowance, it seemed only just that the editor should bear the brunt in this new passage perilous. I shall state, very frankly, the qualifications which I think I may advance in regard to this volume. I believe I have read most of the French and English literature proper of the period that is in print, and much, if not most, of the German. I know somewhat less of Icelandic and Provençal, still less of Spanish and Italian as regards this period, but something also of them. Welsh and Irish I know only in translations. Now it so happens that, for the period, French is, more than at any other time, the capital literature of Europe. Very much of the rest is directly translated from it. Still more is imitated in form. All the great subjects, the great matières, are French in their early treatment, with the exception of the national work of Spain, Iceland, and in part Germany. All the forms, except those of the prose saga and its kinsman the German first folk epic, are found first in French. Whosoever knows the French literature of the 12th and 13th centuries knows not merely the best literature in form, and all but the best in matter of the time, but that which all the time was imitating, or shortly about to imitate, both in form and matter. Again, England presents during this time, though no great English work written in the English tongue for English men, yet the spectacle, unique in history, of a language and a literature undergoing a sea change, from which it was to emerge with incomparably greater beauty and strength than it had before, and in condition to vie with, some would say to outstrip, all actual or possible rivals. German, if not quite supreme in any way, gives an interesting and fairly representative example of a chapter of national literary history. Less brilliant and original in performance than the French, less momentous and unique in promise than the English, but more normal than either, and furnishing the epics of which the Nibelungenlied and Kudrun are the chief examples, and in the best works of the Minnesingers, things not only of historical but intrinsic value in all but the highest degree. Provençal and Icelandic literature at this time are both of them of far greater intrinsic interest than English, if not than German, and they are infinitely more original. But it so happens that the prominent qualities of form in the first, of matter and spirit in the second, though intense and delightful, are not very complicated, various, or wide-ranging. If monotony were not by association a question-begging word, it might be applied with much justice to both, and it is consequently not necessary to have read every Icelandic saga in the original, every Provençal lyric with a strictly philological competence, in order to appreciate the literary value of the contributions which these two charming isolations made to European history. Yet again, the production of Spain during this time is of the smallest, containing perhaps nothing save the poem of the Cid, which is at once certain in point of time and distinguished in point of merit, while that of Italy is not merely dependent to a great extent on Provençal, but can be better handled in connection with Dante, who falls to the province of the writer of the next volume. The Celtic tongues were either past or not come to their chief performance, and it so happens that, by the confession of the most ardent Celticists, who speak as scholars, no Welsh or Irish texts affecting the capital question of the Arthurian legends can be certainly attributed to the 12th or early 13th centuries. It seemed to me, therefore, that I might, without presumption, undertake the volume. Of the execution as apart from the undertaking others must judge. I will only mention, to show that the book is not a mere compilation, that the chapter on the Arthurian romances summarizes, for the first time in print, the results of 20 years' independent study of the subject, and that the views on prosody given in Chapter 5 are not borrowed from anyone. I have dwelt on this less as a matter of personal explanation, which is generally superfluous to friends and never disarms foes, than in order to explain and illustrate the principle of the series. All its volumes have been, or will be, allotted on the same principle, that of occasionally postponing or antedating detailed attention to the literary production of countries which are not at the moment of the first consequence, while giving greater prominence to those that were, but at the same time never losing sight of the general literary drift of the whole of Europe during the whole period in each case. It is to guard against such loss of sight that the plan of committing each period to a single writer, instead of strapping together bundles of independent essays by specialists, has been adopted. For a survey of each time is what is aimed at, and a survey is not to be satisfactorily made but by one pair of eyes. As the individual study of different literatures deepens and widens, these surveys may be more and more difficult. They may have to be made more and more by allowance. But they are also more and more useful, not to say more and more necessary, lest a deeper and wider ignorance should accompany the deeper and wider knowledge. The dangers of this ignorance will hardly be denied, and it would be invidious to produce examples of them from writings of the present day. But there can be nothing ungenerous in referring honoris, not invidie causa, to one of the very best literary histories of this or any century, Mr. Ticknor's Spanish literature. There was perhaps no man of his time who was more widely read, or used his reading with a steadier industry and a better judgment than Mr. Ticknor. Yet the remarks on assonance, on long monorhymed or single assonance tirades, and his note on Berceo, show almost entire ignorance of the whole prosody of the chanson de geste, which gives such an indispensable light in reference to the subject, and which, even at the time of his first edition, 1849, if not quite so well known as they are today, existed in print in fair numbers, and had been repeatedly handled by scholars. It is against such mishaps as this that we are here doing our best to supply a guard. Chapter 1. The Function of Latin. This series is intended to survey and illustrate the development of the vernacular literatures of medieval and Europe. And for that purpose it is unnecessary to busy ourselves with more than a part of the Latin writing, which, in a steadily decreasing, but until the end of the last century, an always considerable proportion, served as the vehicle of literary expression. But with a part of it we are as necessarily concerned as we are necessarily compelled to decline the whole. For not only was Latin for centuries the universal means of communication between educated men of different languages, the medium through which such men received their education, the court language, so to speak, of religion, and the vehicle of all the literature of knowledge which did not directly stoop to the comprehension of the unlearned. But it was indirectly as well as directly, unconsciously as well as consciously, a schoolmaster to bring the vernacular languages to literary accomplishment. They could not have helped imitating it, if they would, and they did not think of avoiding imitation of it, if they could. It modified to a very large extent their grammar. It influenced, to an extent almost impossible to overestimate, the prosody of their finished literature. It supplied their vocabulary. It furnished models of all their first conscious literary efforts of the more deliberate kind, and it conditioned those which were more or less spontaneous. But even if we had room, it would profit us little to busy ourselves with diplomatic Latin, or with the Latin of chronicles, with the Latin of such scientific treatises as were written, or with the Latin of theology. All these, except for obvious reasons the first, tended away from Latin into the vernaculars as time went on, and were but of lesser literary moment, even while they continued to be written in Latin. Nor in Bell's Lettres proper was such a serious performances as continued to be written well into our period of capital importance. Such a book, for instance, as the well-known Trojan War by Joseph of Exeter, though it really deserves much of the praise which it used to receive, can never be anything much better than a large prize poem, such as those which still receive, and sometimes deserve, the medals and the gift books of schools and universities. Every now and then a man of irrepressible literary talent, having no vernacular or no public in the vernacular, ready to his hand, will write in Latin a book like the Donorgus Corolonium, which is good literature, the bad Latin. But on the whole it is a fatal flaw of such things, that the better the Latin, the worse must the literature be. We may, however, with advantage select 3 divisions of the Latin literature of our section of the Middle Ages, which have in all cases no small literary importance and interest, and in some not a little literary achievement. And these are the comic and burlesque Latin writings, especially in verse, the hymns, and the great body of philosophical writing, which goes by the general title of scholastic philosophy, and which was at its palmiest time in the later portion of our own special period. It may not be absolutely obvious, but it does not require much thought to discover why the comic and burlesque Latin writing, especially in verse, of the earlier Middle Ages holds such a position. But if we compare such things as the Carmina Burana, or as the Goliardic poems attributed to, or connected with the Walter map, with the early Fabliaux, we shall perceive that while the latter, excellently written as they sometimes are, depend for their comedy chiefly on matter and incident, not indulging much in play on words or subtle adjustment of phrase and cadence. The reverse is the case with the former. A language must have reached some considerable pitch of development, must have been used for a great length of time seriously, and on a large variety of serious subjects, before it is possible for anything short of supreme genius to use it well for comic purposes. Much indeed of this comic use turns on the existence and degradation of recognized serious writing. There was little or no opportunity for any such use or misuse in the infant vernaculars. There was abundant opportunity in literary Latin. Accordingly we find, and should expect to find, very early parodies of the offices and documents of the Church. Things not unnaturally shocking to piety, but perhaps to be justly set down to any profane, much less to any specifically blasphemous intention. While the quarrel arose between the Reformers and Papists, intentional ribaldry no doubt began. But such a thing as, for example, the Missa de Potatoribus, is much more significant of an unquestioning familiarity than of deliberate insult. It is an instance of the same bent of the human mind, which has made very learned and conscientious lawyers burlesque law, and which induces schoolboys and undergraduates to parody the classics, not at all because they hate them, but because they are their most familiar literature. At the same time, this comic degradation, as may be seen in its earliest, and perhaps its greatest practitioner, Aristophanes, no bad citizen or innovating misbeliever, leads naturally to elaborate and ingenious exercises in style, to thorough familiarity with the capacities of language, meter, rhyme. An expertness in all these things, acquired in the Latin, was certain sooner or later to be transferred to the vernacular. No one can read the Latin poems which cluster in Germany round the name of the arch-poet, in England round that of Map, without seeing how much freer of hand is the Latin rhymer, in comparison with him who finds it hard only not to stumble in the vernacular. We feel what a gusto there is in this graceless catchcreasus of solemn phrase and traditionally serious literature. We perceive how the language, colloquially familiar, taught from infancy in the books, provided with plentiful literary examples, and having already received perfect license of accommodation to vernacular rhythms and the poetical ornaments of the hour, puts its stammering rivals, fated though they were to oust it, out of court for the time by its audacious compound of experience and experiment. The first impression of anyone who reads that exceedingly delightful volume, the Camden Society's Poems Attributed to Walter Mapes, may be one of mere amusement, of which there are few books fuller. The agreeable effrontery which the question whether to kiss Rose or Agnes is put side by side with that whether it is better to eat flesh cooked in the cauldron or little fishes driven into the net. The intense solemnity and sorrow for self, with which Golius discourses in trochaic, monorhymed laces of irregular length, de suo infortunio, the galloping dialectics of the apocalypse, the concentrated scandal against the venerated sex of de conjugo non docenda, are jocund enough in themselves, if not invariably edifying. But the good-for-nothing wrote, Fumus et mulia et stulcidia, exponent hominem domo propria, was not merely cracking jokes. He was exercising himself, or his countrymen, or at furthest his successors, in the use of the vernacular tongues with the same lightness and brightness. When he insinuated that dulcis erat mihi status si propenda manuratus, reditur vel alio, vivam licet non habunde, sultam mihi do unde, strudum de proprio. He was showing off how things could be put slyly, how the stiffness and awkwardness of native speech could be suppled and decorated, how the innuendo, the turn of words, the nuance could be imparted to dog Latin. And if to dog Latin, why not to genuine French, or English, or German? And he was showing at the same time how to make verse flexible, how to suit rhythm to meaning, how to give freedom, elasticity, swing. No doubt this had in part been done by the great serious poetry to which we shall come presently, and which he and his kind often directly burlesqued. But in the very nature of things, comic verse must supple language to a degree impossible, or very seldom possible, to serious poetry. And in any case, the mere tricks with language which the parodist has to play familiarize him with the use of it. Even in these days of multifarious writing, it is not absolutely uncommon to find men of education, and not devoid of talent, who confess that they have no notion how to put things, that they cannot express themselves. We can see this tying of the tongue, this inability to use words, far more reasonably prevalent in the infancy of the vernacular tongues, as, for instance, in the constant presence of what the French call chevals, expletive phrases such as the sickly and the I will not lie, the vehement and the everidol, which brought a whole class of not undeserving work, the English verse romances of a later time, into discredit. Latin, with its wide range of already consecrated expressions, and with the practice in it which every scholar had, made recourse to constantly repeated stock phrases at least less necessary, if necessary at all, and the writer's set purpose to amuse made it incumbent on him not to be tedious. A good deal of this comic writing may be graceless. Some of it may, to delicate tastes, be shocking or disgusting. But it was at any rate an obvious and excellent school of word fence, a gymnasium, an exercise ground for style. And if the beneficial effect in the literary sense of these light songs is not to be overlooked, how much greater in every way is that of the magnificent compositions of which they were in some cases the parody. It will be more convenient to postpone to a later chapter of this volume a consideration of the exact way in which Latin sacred poetry affected the prosody of the vernacular. But it is well here to point out that almost all the finest and most famous examples of the medieval hymn, with perhaps the sole exception of Veni Sancte Spiritus, date from the 12th and 13th centuries. Ours are the stately rhythms of Adam of St. Victor, and the softer ones of St. Bernard the Greater. It was at this time that Jacopone da Todi, in the intervals of his eccentric vernacular exercises, was inspired to write the Stabat Mater. From this time comes that glorious descant of Bernard of Mollio, in which the most famous and very elegant English paraphrase is read beside it. The more does the greatness and the beauty of the original appear. And from this time comes the greatest of all hymns, and one of the greatest of all poems, the Dies Irae. There have been attempts, more than one of them, to make out that the Dies Irae is no such wonderful thing after all. Attempts which are, perhaps, the extreme examples of that cheap and despicable paradox, which thinks to escape the charge of blind docility by the affectation of heterodox independence. The judgment of the greatest, and not always the most pious, men of letters of modern times, may confirm those who are uncomfortable without authority in a different opinion. Fortunately, there is not likely ever to be lack of those who, authority or no authority, in youth and in age, after much reading or without much, in all time of their tribulation and in all time of their wealth, will hold these wonderful triplets, be they Thomas of Solano's or another's, as nearly or quite the most perfect wedding of sound, to sense that they know. It would be possible indeed to illustrate a complete dissertation on the methods of expression in serious poetry from the 51 lines of the Dies Irae. Rhyme, alliteration, cadence, and adjustment of vowel and consonant values, all these things receive perfect expression in it, or at least in the first 13 stanzas, for the last 4 are a little inferior. It is quite astonishing to reflect upon the careful art, or for the felicitous accident, of such a line as Tuba Miriam Spurgus Sonum, with the thud of the trochee falling in each instance in a different vowel, and still more in the continuous sequence of 5 stanzas, from Judex Oger to Non Sit Cassius, in which not a word could be displaced or replaced by another without loss. The climax of verbal harmony, corresponding to and expressing religious passion and religious awe, is reached in the last, Quens misidesti lassus, redemiste crucem passus, tantus lobo non sit cassus, with a sudden change from the dominant E sounds, except in the rhyme foot, of the first 2 lines to the A's of the last, is simply miraculous, and miraculously assisted by what may be called the internal subrhyme of sedisti and redemisti. This latter effect can rarely be attempted without a jingle. There is no jingle here, only an ineffable melody. After the Dies Irae, no poet could say that any effect of poetry was, as far as the sound goes, unattainable, though few could have hoped to equal it, and perhaps no one except Dante and Shakespeare has fully done so. Beside the grace and the grandeur, the passion and the art of this wonderful composition, even the best remaining examples of medieval hymn writing may look a little pale. It is possible for criticism, which is not hypercriticism, to object to the pathos of the Stabat, that is a trifle luscious, to find fault with the rhyme scheme of Jesu Dulcis Memoria, that it is a little faint and frittered, while of course those who do not like conceits and far-fetched interpretations can always quarrel with the substance of Adam of St. Victor. But those who care for merits rather than for defects will never be weary of admiring the best of these hymns, or of noticing, and as far as possible, understanding their perfection. Although the language they use is old, and their subjects are those which are very competent, and not all irreligious critics have denounced as unfavorable to poetry, the special poetical charm as we conceive it in modern days is not merely present in them, but is present in a manner of which few traces can be found in classical times. And some such students, at least, will probably go on to examine the details of the hymn writer's method, with the result of finding more such things as have been pointed out above. Let us, for instance, take the rhythm of Bernard the Englishman, as he was really, though called of Molio. Jerusalem the Golden has made some of its merits common property, while its practical discoverer, Archbishop Trench, has sent those of the original forth with a judicious enthusiasm which cannot be bettered. The point is how these merits, these effects, are produced. The piece is a crucial one, because grotesque as its arrangement would probably have seemed to an Augustan, its peculiarities are superadded to, not substituted for, the requirements of classical prosody. The writer does not avail himself of the new accentual quantification, and his other licenses are but few. If we examine the poem, however, we shall find that, besides the abundant use of rhyme, interior as well as final, he avails himself of all those artifices of what may be called word music, suggesting beauty by a running accompaniment of sound, which are the main secret of modern verse. He is not satisfied, ample as it may seem, with his double rhyme harmony. He confines himself to it. Indeed, in the famous overture couplet, Hora novissima, tempora pessima sunt, vigilimus, ecce menacita eminent arbiter ille suprimus. But immediately afterwards, and more or less throughout, he redoubles and redoubles again every possible artifice. Sound repetition in the eminent of the third line, alliteration in recta ruminet of the fourth, and everywhere trills and roulades, not limited to the actually rhyming syllables of the same vowel. Tunc nova gloria pectra sobria clarificabit, candida lilia, vivia monelia, sunt tibi sponsa, te petto, te colo, te flagro, te volo, canto, saluto. He instinctively discovered the necessity of varying as much as possible the cadence and composition of the last third of his verse, and carefully avoids anything like the monotonous use of his only spondi. In a batch of 18 lines taken at random, there are only 6 end words of 2 syllables, and these only once rhyme together. The consequence of these and other devices is that the whole poem is accompanied by a sort of swirl and eddy of sound and cadence, constantly varying, constantly shifting its centers and systems, but always assisting the sense with a grateful clash or murmur, according as it is loud or soft of word music. The vernacular languages were not as yet in case to produce anything so complicated as this, and some of them have never been quite able to produce it to this day. But it must be obvious at once what a standard was held up before poets, almost every one of whom, even if he had been but small Latin in a general way, heard these hymns constantly sung, and what means of producing like effects were suggested to them. The most varied and charming lyric of the Middle Ages, that of the German Minnesingers, shows the effect of this Latin practice side by side, or rather inextricably mingled, with the effects of the preciser French and Provençal verse scheme, and the still looser, but equally musical, though half inarticulate, suggestions of indigenous song. That English prosody, the prosody of Shakespeare and Coleridge, or Shelley and Keats, owes its origin to a similar admixture, and the present writer, at least, has no doubt at all, while even those who deny this can hardly deny the positive literary achievement of the best medieval hymns. They stand by themselves. Latin, which despite its constant colloquial life, still even in the Middle Ages had in profane use many of the drawbacks of a dead language, being either slipshod or stiff. Here, owing to the millennium and more during which it had been throughout Western Europe, the living language, and the sole living language of the Church Universal, shakes off at once all artificial and doggerel character. It is thoroughly alive. It comes from the writers' hearts as easily as from their pens. They have in the fullest sense proved it. They know exactly what they can do, and in this particular sphere, there is hardly anything they cannot do. And I think I'm going to call it there for tonight. Apologies for my Latin pronunciation to anyone who's made it this far. But you can carry on where we're leaving off by finding the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.